Welcome to Networking RX, a podcast devoted to helping business professionals like you enhance your networking skills in order to become more proficient giving and receiving quality business referrals and improving the overall quality of your life and the lives of those around you. The Networking RX podcast is a production of AmSpirit Business Connections, an organization whose mission is to empower business success through networking.
When I was a young lawyer, I remembered sitting across from a client who clearly needed help. That's why they're going to an attorney. But I couldn't quite get them to move forward. Obviously I had the credentials. I had a law degree. I had an MBA. I had CPA. I had the knowledge. I had solutions. But I didn't have the message. I was explaining things the way I understood them. I don't want to say out and out jargon, but it was kind of what was going on in my mind. And it wasn't the way they needed to hear them. And you could kind of feel it. The conversation was just kind of, let's say it drifted. There's no connection, no action. And I contrast that with different moment, different client, years later, same table, my office, different approach. And instead of leading with information, I led with a story. And at that point, I probably had more stories where I could reference other clients that I was working with. The situation, the stress, the outcome. And you could see their eyes. Not just their eyes, their body language. They leaned in. For me, I had the same expertise, although I had more experience, but same solution. But this time, the message landed because communication isn't about what you say. It's about what they hear, feel, and connect to. And that's exactly where today's guest lives and works. Jordan Grenadier Murphy. Did I get that right?
Yes.
All right. She's a communication strategist who helps leaders, brands, and individuals find the right words when the stakes are high. From her early days, she started working in her parents' retail store, and we'll touch on that when she was 11. She worked in politics and advising executives. She's built a career translating complex ideas into messages that connect and move people to action. And a lot of times that's what we need. She also brings that same expertise into personal relationships as a Gottman-trained couples coach. Because whether we're in business or life, communication is about saying important things to important people the right way. And so Jordan sits at the intersection of strategy, empathy, and clarity. And today we're going to unpack how to communicate so your message actually lands. Jordan, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much, Frank. I'm excited to be here.
All right. So you started learning about communication when you were 11, working in your parents' store, running your parents' store. What did that experience teach you about connecting with people? And it really, I guess, still shows up in your work today.
Yeah, it was a little bit of a wild time. I think back, and even my parents now think, maybe that wasn't the best idea, leaving an 11-year-old to run the store. But it was interesting for me to be able to see, I learned pretty early that there were these spiels that you could share in kind of a sales environment to get someone to buy something, and pretty quickly learned how to adjust those based on who I was talking to, being able to understand when someone walked into a store and wanted to be talked to and wanted to be told about products they were looking at versus the person who was just there to browse and, didn't want to converse with you. And so it was really an interesting way for me to learn about communication styles and how, I could give the same spiel to every person who walked in the door, but the way that it was delivered, the things that people cared about, the things that got people to take action were so different from person to person. And so much of it became about reading body language and understanding people's motivations for being in the store and getting to know people on a more personal level and why they were there. And so all of those things have just translated into everything that I've done in my career since. So it's really interesting to reflect back on that and see how that had such a big, such a big connection to what I do today.
Well, this is somewhat off topic. when you go into stores, I don't want to say you're judgy towards workers, but I mean you're kind of seeing things. Do you know kind of when you're being played, like okay, that's a script, or this person's being genuine, things like that?
I do. I have a very sensitive radar for that kind of thing, and there are some stores, boutiques where I have connected with the owners to talk about potentially doing some communication training for their staff. There was one incident around the holidays where I walked into a store and um, the poor girl who is standing at the front was just telling me about every sale that was happening within the store and using really technical language about their different bays and different areas of the store. And I just wanted to stop and explain, I'm not really interested in those things and those technical terms I don't care about. And I don't do that. I just smile and nod, but
Yeah.
it's definitely something that I take note of.
Well, you can see when opportunities are missed. So that's. I mean, you can't help it, right? I mean, I used to be an attorney. I just see things differently, and I would imagine people who are former fitness consultants see things differently, and we all have our own experiences. So it's not all about the words, right? You say communication issues aren't really about the words, but help us understand, I guess, what's actually going on or what's going wrong when messages don't land.
Yeah, for sure. So I have training in a handful of things related to communication. One of them is the Gottman method, like you mentioned, that's really specific to communication with romantic relationships. I'm also trained in something called nonviolent communication. And really, the thing that connects both of those to all of the work that I've done is really about getting to the heart of maybe what's not being said. What are some of those deeper motivations for something? And where sometimes words are important. Obviously, sticks and stones is a
Right.
saying for a reason, but words can still carry a lot of weight. And I also have a background in marketing. And so all of these things tie into each other that you can say something, but there has to be this bigger meaning behind it, or else it's not going to land. And so a lot of the work that I do is helping my clients, whether it's a couple in a relationship or an executive team or a small business, is really about helping them figure out what is the deeper meaning of the thing that they're trying to say, and then helping them figure out words and tactics and systems and tools and all of those things that go along with it to actually get that message across. So again, words are really powerful and sometimes they can do a lot, but you could have two people say the exact same thing and say the same script or spiel or whatever it is.
Hmm.
And kind of like what you mentioned in your intro story, that it doesn't necessarily land the same every time.
Yeah. There are, again, off topic, I guess, there are studies out there. Um, I knew this young woman when I was just finishing up college, and she had a baby, um, and the baby had her daughter had cerebral palsy, and they suspected it was something that the doctor had done. And her sisters, her girlfriends, and her mother and family were really pushing that she go after the doctor, and she never did. And she said, I didn't want to because he just was so nice. He just had this amazing bedside manner. And so I've read studies that say that exact thing. If you're a doctor and you're really cold, you could be the brightest doctor in the world, and if there's a screw up or even a hint of a screw up, they're coming after you. But if you've got this bedside manner, you're less likely to, it's kind of right in line with what you're talking about, how we connect with people.
Absolutely. There's a really great resource that I love to recommend, a book called Super Communicators
Mm,
that actually touches on a lot of medical communication and how much that goes into malpractice lawsuits and how likely you are to run into something like that. And it really all comes back to, do the people that you're talking to feel heard and understood and like you care about them and you're coming from a meaningful place? Or do they feel like you are acting like you're smarter than them, talking down to them, don't really care about what happens when they leave the room. And all of that applies to every interpersonal interaction that
Yeah.
we have with people.
Well, that's a great lead into the next question I have for you. Because you work in both the brand strategy and couples coaching, right? I mean, let's talk about um, that runs the gamut, right? I mean, you're kind of like the mechanic and you do the detailing also. Um, where do you see the strongest overlap between business communication and relationship communication? I say all the time, people come to me, I asked a question, I interrupted the answer. Um, oh, geez, my business is, I just can't quite figure it out. And it's like, man, you have such a great personal relationship. You just do that here. You know, to me, it's so simple because there is a lot of overlap. Not the same, but there's a lot of overlap.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say the types of couples that I tend to work with, because I am a couples coach and I'm not a therapist, I I get to play this role that is almost like it's less intimidating than
Hmm.
going to, you know, a couples therapist. That sounds
Right.
so like problematic and things must be so bad if you're doing that, right? And so I get to play this role where it's a little bit of an easier entry point, and I'm typically working with people who are, the same types of clients that I work with in the business world. They're executives, they're high earners, they're people who give a lot to their work. And not to say that that translates to not giving a lot to their relationships, but they're people who really understand a corporate environment. And so there tends to be a lot of overlap in how I consult with clients on the romantic relationship side versus a corporate environment where we use a lot of business analogy. We'll use a lot of really specific tools and tactics. I'm not someone who is interested in being in an organization or in a relationship forever. I'm someone who wants to come in and give them the right tools to be able to execute these things on their own. And so that's something that is true no matter what type of client I'm working with. But in terms of overlap in the types of problems or challenges that we're solving for,
Yeah.
it is typically people who they they have really good motivations and the things that they're saying are just not landing and they don't understand why. And so they continue to push whatever narrative they have because it's almost like when this kind of funny idea when you're talking to somebody who doesn't share your same native language. And if they don't understand, you get louder. That instinct of like, I'll just say it more. Um, that tends to happen in corporate environments and in romantic relationships where you feel this thing and you feel like you understand it so deeply. And if you just keep saying it, if you say it a little louder, then maybe the person you're talking to will get really clear on it. And so I see this a lot on the corporate side where teams will invest a ton in marketing or PR or whatever it is, and they just keep trying to push this thing that is not landing and they can't figure out why. And then, same thing in relationships, couples have the same fights over and over and over again. And some of those, um, the Gottmans have a ton of great research on this that there are fights and conflicts that you'll have in your relationships that are not problems to be solved. They're just two individuals having different ideas that neither of you are going to move on, and you just have to find a compromise. And so that's really normal. But this idea that you have to be so steadfast in the exact words that you're using and how you're saying something and not really budging on something in order to let it be heard in the right way. I think that's the biggest similarity I see across
Yeah.
all the different clients I work with.
Well, one of the things I was thinking of as you were talking is I had somebody on the podcast years ago who was um, in the couple space, and he said, everybody comes to a marriage with four relationships. I think the relationship with themselves, the relationship with their mom, their dad, and then their parents' relationship, right? And so if you're coming from a family who has where money's tight, right, and it's just in another family where it's not, you're gonna run into issues, and maybe that's too obvious. But even how we define things or how we come to compromise. Someone could have parents that are really great at compromising, and they see that and they can model that, or it's been modeled for them and they can repeat it. And then there's another where it's, parents fight like cats and dogs, and that's the normal thing. Um, well, I shared with you before we hit record. I guess I'll sit out. My wife never listens to these shows, uh, um, but growing up, my parents fought a lot, and they got divorced, and they had a counselor or a therapist who said, "You guys should never gotten married." And that's how I saw my parents fighting, fighting, fighting. And I was in a relationship where there was just this constant fighting, and I didn't want that, and I was trying to fix it, and trying to fix it, and trying to fix it, and never could fix it because that's what the other person wanted. They just wanted to keep throwing gas on the fire. So I got out of that relationship, and I got a relationship with my wife, going to be married 32 years. Or by the time this comes out, probably have hit that. But at any rate, I kept waiting for these fights, and they never happened. And I'm coming into this with a whole different experience. So anyhow, I don't know if that makes any sense at all, but it does to me.
No, it absolutely does. And this is so true in romantic relationships, it's true in friendships, it's true in business partnerships, it's true in, how you engage with service providers. And everybody has this, emotional baggage, for lack of a better word, that they're coming into any interaction with.
Yeah.
You have this idea that someone is going to behave a certain way, respond a certain way. You've sometimes have thought about what someone else's motivations are, or if someone is judgmental, or if someone is going to be upset by something that you tell them, or, we all come in with these preconceived notions of what the other person is offering. And that affects our communication so much, which is one of the things I really love about nonviolent communication, which is a book. It's my most recommended communication book. And it really gets to the heart of being able to look at things really objectively and take a lot of that emotion out. So, this idea that you had going into your relationship with your wife, that couples fight, and if I just react a certain way, then I can stop the fighting. And so,
Yeah.
you have this feeling and this expectation of how your wife is going to show up, or how you think she's going to show up next time, or whatever it is. And it's really freeing to be able to look at things from an objective point of view and really talk through with your partner, or
Yeah.
whoever you're talking to, be able to break down just objectively what's happening and get to the root of maybe some deeper meaning and deeper feelings behind this. And I also want to say, I give the caveat to every client I work with through my couples coaching, that some of this stuff feels so clinical. It feels so awkward when you start doing it, because we're not trained to communicate with each other. We, you know, just get sent out into the world to start conversing with one another, and we pick up these things along the way, and we don't really have this rule book of the right way to do things, or how to get the best response, or whatever it is. And so there's so much unlearning and retraining that has to go into successfully communicating with someone else. So a lot of this stuff is, takes a lot of time to work through.
Yeah, obviously that's why you have a business, right? If it were simple, you wouldn't have a business. When someone knows that conversation matters, whether it's a client, a team member, or a spouse, what's the biggest mistake they make going into that? Or mistakes? I don't need to narrow it down to one, but
Yeah, are you thinking about kind of that, like already having an idea of where someone else is at? Is that
yeah, I do they try and steer maybe? I mean, sometimes I feel like I have conversations with people, and I feel like I'm being manipulated, right?
yeah?
They're asking a question, and I'm trying to think of a good example. Like I've had a franchisee once, and there's requirements in the franchise system. What is the bare minimum, right? What do you mean by the bare minimum? It's like I just feel like you're trying to get me to say a word, and it's like, okay, do I actually have to stay for the whole meeting? Well, not the whole meeting. Well, 10 minutes, if I just put my foot through the door, am I the, you know what I mean? It's just like, whoa, 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 I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a
Yeah.
mistake.
No, that's definitely a thing. And I think, to bring it back to networking, I think this is a big thing that you see in networking, right? You go to a networking event and you start talking to somebody who it feels like they're not asking you any questions. They're just waiting for their next opportunity to talk. They've already rehearsed what they're going to say.
Hmm.
There's so many different styles that people come to conversations with. I am someone who tends to think through what a conversation is going to look like. And I have to really stop myself and force myself when I go into a new conversation to be open to whatever that experience is, because I'm a really type A person. And so my wheels just start spinning and I start thinking about, okay, I'm going to talk about this, and then they'll probably talk about this, and then
Mm.
it'll go in this direction. And I have to stop myself. That is my natural course, but that doesn't do well for a good conversation with anyone. So everybody definitely has their own style that they would bring to the way that they communicate with people. And I think so much of it just gets down to what someone's motivation is. I am someone as a type A person, so much of that is about control, and safety and comfort and all of those things. And so if I feel like I know where a conversation is going, then it feels safer. It doesn't feel scary. Same thing can be true, if you are setting up a meeting. I talk to a lot of leaders about this. If they're setting up a meeting with someone who reports to them, making sure that they are providing an agenda, making sure that, they're not reaching out to an employee at 4 o'clock on a Friday to set up a Monday morning meeting that employee is then going to ruminate on all weekend long.
Yeah.
Like there's so many things that just taking into consideration what your motivation is, taking into consideration what the goal of any conversation is, which again, this makes it sound like every conversation is so calculated, but so much of this stuff just the more you do it, the more you start to realize, okay, I am going into this being really controlling, or I'm going into this prepared to, imposter syndrome comes up a lot with people I work with. And so they may feel like they need to speak louder in meetings or say more things because then they'll get noticed. But if they're not saying things that are particularly helpful to a conversation, it may be doing more damage than what they think they're doing. With couples I work with, if a couple is fighting, there may be an urge to get in the last word, or all of these things, but the motivation is so it's all about yourself. And so being able to take a step back and think about, okay, what is the relationship here with the person that I'm communicating with? How can I provide some value to them still? How can this be a two-way street? How can we communicate in a way that's effective for both parties?
Yeah. You mentioned being type A. I'm probably type A minus. No, I don't. But I used to try to be really controlling. I'd go into a conversation with the end in mind and be totally frustrated because they were kind of like this ADHD conversant person. They didn't care, right? And so I'm trying to herd cats, trying to get them to wherever. And then in time, I realized that it was frustrating and a waste of energy, and I didn't need to get to where I wanted to get in that conversation.
Yeah.
It was more about, okay, I just need to build a relation. I can come back to that. I need them to do this, unless it's like, hey, put the fire out now. But if it's just kind of, hey, we're kind of a long-term relationship, then let's just, all right, that was successful. I didn't get everything. Um, I got to first base, right? I'm worry about second base next time. So anyhow, all right. someone's listening, they want to get better at communicating in their networking or referral conversations. Get a lot of people listening here. Or just relationships in general, business relationships. What's one simple shift they can make immediately to help them just improve? Maybe not miraculously change everything, but just take that little step in the right direction.
Yeah. I think it's what we just talked about. It's being cognizant of what you're going into a conversation with. If you're going into something with that end in mind, how can you be open to a new or a different experience? How can you just be present for the conversation? And then another nice shift, and this is true in corporate settings, it's true with couples that I work with. If there is something like what you said, if there was a fire that needed to be put out, um, being willing to go into a conversation saying that up front, like, hey, we really need to talk about XYZ thing. My goal is to find a solution to X and Y and at least have a game plan for what we're going to do about Z by the end of this conversation. Making sure that the other person is open to that too. That's really more important in the romantic relationships, right? Where you may be catching somebody as they're walking out the door. That might be an unfair time to say, I expect that we sit down and knock all these things out. But if you're a leader and you're talking to somebody on your team, that can absolutely be an expectation that you set from the get-go. But really just expectation setting for yourself and for the person that you're talking to, I think is going to do wonders for your communication and kind of the results that you get from the people that you're talking to.
Okay, great. Shifting gears, somebody wants to get a hold of you, somebody wants to work with you. I guess describe how that looks and how they can find you.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find me on LinkedIn at Jordan Grenadier Murphy or at jordangrenadiermurphy.com. I work with people in a couple of different ways. I offer fractional support for businesses who are looking for executive level support but not ready to bring on someone full time. I work with a handful of organizations in that capacity at a time. And then I also offer project-based work. So if someone is looking to really hone in their messaging, I have a great service for that. I also do a lot of crisis communication or media training. So if you've got a really specific communications issue that you want to work on, we can knock that out in a half or a full day session. And then I also will help people kind of figure out general problems related to communications and marketing and branding. So if anyone wants to reach out to me, they can find me at jordangrenadiermurphy.com and we can talk through specifically what they're looking for and how either I can best support them, or I also have an incredible Rolodex of people who are excellent at what they do. And I love referring the right people to the right clients. So I'm always happy to make an introduction if I'm not the right person.
I'll get your website in the show notes. Well, I really appreciate your time today.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Frank.
All right, let's go back to that moment I started with, that table. It was a table. I didn't have a desk as an attorney. I just had a table. But it's the same professional, me, really the same opportunity, similar client, same need sitting across from me. But in one case, nothing happened. In the other, it worked out. Everything moved forward. What changed? To a degree, it was experience, but it wasn't expertise. I was still the same attorney. The law hadn't changed. It wasn't the offer. I charged the same. It really came down to that connection. And that's the game we're all playing, whether we realize it or not. Every conversation is a moment where something important could happen or quietly slip away. Jordan reminded us today that communication isn't about being clever. And it's not about having the perfect script. It's about understanding the person in front of you and making sure they feel understood. Because when people feel understood, they'll lean in. And we can actually see that when we talk to people. And when they lean in, they trust. And when people trust, things tend to move forward. I learned that early on. If I could just build that trust, they were going to buy from me. They were going to be clients. So here's the takeaway. It's simple. I know it's simple, but not easy. The next time you're in a conversation that matters, and you probably have one every day, the next time you're in a conversation that matters, don't just focus on what you want to say. focus on making sure it lands, because in the end, the difference between missed opportunities and meaningful relationships often comes down to one thing. Not the message you deliver, but it's the connection you create.
Thanks for joining us on the Networking RX podcast. Please put what you've learned into action today and let us know if you have questions, comments, or ideas for future topics. You can email them to us at podcast@amspirit.com. That's AmSpirit.com. Finally, so you never miss an episode, be sure to subscribe to the Networking RX podcast through iTunes, Overcast, or however you receive your podcasts. Now get out and network with someone.
The Networking RX podcast is the copyright production of AmSpirit Business Connections. All rights reserved.